Welcome back to the Photaudiography podcast. I'm your host Luke, and today I'll be talking about what kind of camera equipment you need, so stick around for this episode. So to start off with, I want to address a really big misconception that I see with photographers that I've worked with, and that is that a great camera does not automatically equal great photos. And you can spend thousands of dollars in equipment, but that does not guarantee that you're going to get good photos. And that's sort of where I like to give my first piece of advice when people ask me, like, what kind of camera do you think I should get? I always say, first and foremost, use whatever equipment you already have. If you don't have any, then maybe you need to look into getting something. But overall, use what equipment you have and learn how to use it more to do what you want to do. And I used to work in camera sales, and customers would come in and want me to sell them something. And this is probably why I don't work in camera sales anymore, but I would not want to sell them because I'm like, well, what's wrong with what you have? Like, I'd always ask them, what are you using your camera for? And they'd tell me, and I'd be like, well, yeah, that should be more than sufficient for what you need. And I think people just sort of thought if I got a new camera or something, that would make my photos so much better. And to a certain point, that's true, but at another point, you need to step back and say, would traveling somewhere make my photos better? Would learning how to use more settings on my camera be better? Would experimenting a little more with my equipment be better? Rather than just buying a new camera and saying, well, this is going to give me good photos. Also, if you are looking to buy new equipment or new camera, it's important to have sort of a clear goal in mind. So if you're just starting out as like a hobby photography person, sort of like me, you've been doing it for years, but you're like, I need some new equipment, my equipment's outdated and it just doesn't give me the results that I'm looking for. Have a goal in mind. If you're wanting to make money off your photography, then maybe you can put a few more bucks into it. But if you're just doing it mostly for fun, maybe, consider looking at pre-owned equipment, which I'll get to here in a little bit. But yeah, have a clear goal in mind. If you're not wanting to make money off of it, you might want to consider how much money you're putting into your equipment in the first place. If you're looking at cameras and you don't want to be worried with fiddling around with a lot of settings and things, look for a camera that has automatic modes and modes that you pretty much set it and forget it. And that's something that I think is a huge misconception, and I blame it some on the marketing campaigns of camera companies that they default to selling people who are starting out into like doing family photos and stuff for their family and defaulting to get a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. And sometimes with some people, your cell phone is all you need. Phone cameras are amazing from what they used to be to what they are now. So sometimes a phone camera is all you need. And a lot of times I'll ask people, if you buy a camera, are you going to be motivated to get it out and use it rather than whipping out your phone and taking a picture with it? Because we all do it. It's so easy to take pictures on our phone. And a lot of times for what we need, the quality is fine. And I always like to tell people that because it really puts it in perspective, is you don't need to, your phone, some people spend a lot of money on their phones. And if you're using that for your camera and it's giving you what you need for pictures of the kids or your pets or whatever, then should you actually be putting a lot more money? A lot of cameras on phones nowadays have more manual settings, and there's apps where you can sort of control the settings of your camera more. So they're getting more and more like what I would call a real camera by giving you those settings to play with. But I think so often it's sort of default to a DSLR or more recently mirrorless cameras, and I always ask people to think twice before that because you really don't know what you're getting into. Some people don't. Because with that, you have to buy lenses. And here's another thing. People don't realize that if they want the zoom range that they're used to on like a point and shoot camera, you are not going to get that on a DSLR or mirrorless camera unless you spend thousands of dollars on a zoom lens, because the sensors in point and shoot cameras are smaller, and the way they can make the optics, I don't know a whole lot about it, but I do know a little, that they can have 50 times zoom on a relatively small point and shoot camera. So if you like just taking like casual bird photos and stuff, maybe a good advanced point and shoot camera would be better off than getting, let's say, a DSLR or mirrorless camera. Something I also like to tell people is be careful when choosing a brand, especially if you are going into the DSLR or mirrorless camera realm, is because your decision to choose a brand might sort of be a lifelong decision. And personally, if you're not already invested in equipment from one company or another, I would say look at the lens lineup first and sort of see what the different companies offer, especially if you have very specific needs for your photography. Like if you really enjoy doing macro shots or, you know, something specialized like that, I would say if you're not already invested in an equipment from a certain company, look at the lens lineup, see what they have to offer in the price range, and also look at third-party options like Sigma or Tamron. But I will warn you, beware of really cheap lenses. I mean, I personally, you know, have had good experience with both Sigma and Tamron and own lenses from those companies, and I've owned some cheap lenses which end up in the garbage because they're like putting a potato on your camera. And that's another thing, is the lens really does make the photos, because that's the optics. The camera body itself, that's certainly, you know, I don't want to downplay that, but the optics are really what's going to set your images over the edge. But let me just back up here a second. I was talking about companies, and you want to make a good decision because you might be stuck with this company, you know, for life. That's not to say people don't switch companies, and I know people who have switched companies. A lot of times I find you're not able to afford it because you have all this money invested in equipment from one company, and even if you resell it, you just won't get back what you put into it. And I often like to tell people that you should really be looking firsthand at the cameras you're looking at. So go to, if you have a local camera store, even if you have to drive a little way, get your hands on a camera. Even if it's not the specific camera you're looking at, just a camera that's similar, or even just a camera that is that brand, just so you can get a feel for the camera in your hands, and you can look at sort of like the menu systems and how they lay out their cameras and menus and things. That's really important. I mean, you can look at cameras on, you know, paper and compare and make decisions that way, but honestly, you're going to be holding this thing, you know, it's going to get heavy carrying it around different places. So being able to actually feel it, and I think if nothing else, that's going to make your decision if, you know, one company's camera feels better in your hand versus another. That's going to make all the difference, because when it all boils down, any of the camera companies are going to give you a good result. It's like I was saying at the beginning, use whatever equipment you already have. It's more your ability to use the equipment more so than the equipment's ability to take the picture. I'll just briefly go over the 3 major brands that I'm familiar with and know the most about. And I will give you a full disclosure here. I shoot Nikon equipment, and I don't think that Nikon is superior to any other brand in any way. It's just what I've shot with for years, and I invested money into that in the beginning. You know, I went to a store, I looked at Canon, Sony, and Nikon, and the Nikon felt good in my hands. I really liked it and ended up going with that. And like I say, it's sort of become a lifelong decision now that I've invested money in that. And it's sort of like, I think there's great things that other camera companies are putting out, but I really don't feel that I need to spend my money on that. Plus, at this point, I've invested too much money in Nikon equipment to jump ship to another brand. Anyway, but I just wanted to give you sort of full disclosure. So take what I say with a grain of salt, but I really don't have anything partial to any of these brands. So I'll start with Sony because they have really blown up in the past few years, and they're more sort of futuristic and innovative with their products, and they're not afraid to push ahead new technology, which is something, if that's something that's very important to you, that you sort of have the latest technology with your equipment, go to Sony. If I was shooting professionally and doing that as my full-time job, I think I would definitely put my money towards Sony equipment, just because with things that they've pushed out faster than the other companies, like with their eye autofocus and just their mirrorless lineup in general, I think it's very, very good equipment, and I've used it before and I really liked it. But like I say, I've invested my money in Nikon, and since I do it more as a hobby, it's not worth my money to really jump ship just so that I can say I have a Sony. But I have used their equipment, and I will say, I'll say it again, if I was doing this full-time as my full-time job, I think I would invest my money in Sony equipment. So Canon and Nikon, well, I'll sort of talk about Canon and Nikon. So they're a little bit more conservative in their approaches to new technology and pushing out the new technology, like the mirrorless and things like eye autofocus. They're a little bit behind Sony with that. And so if that's important to you, Sony is definitely leading the way with that. But I'll just, say a few words about Canon and Nikon. So Canon, from what people have told me and what I've seen, Canon is more known for having good contrast and color quality with their photos, which makes sense because they make a lot of printers and like scanners and a lot of other devices like that. So it would make sense that they sort of have a focus on having good contrast and color with their photos. And with Nikon, I've heard, and from my experience, Nikon is a little bit more user-friendly for beginners, and the menus are explain things a little bit more for beginners, especially in their lower-end DSLRs. They have different things that help out. So that's one thing that I've sort of been told and read. That's what I started with and learned from there, and sort of self-taught a lot of stuff. But going back to what I said earlier, any camera from any of these brands, even brands I didn't mention, there's so many other brands, they'll all give you good products. It's not like you can look at a photo and say, oh, I know what camera that was taken with. It's more your ability to use the equipment. So yeah, whatever you're most comfortable with, go for it. Another thing I wanted to talk about, and I did talk about earlier, was considering third-party equipment, like third-party lenses like Sigma or Tamron. They are great lens companies. That's all they do is make lenses. And I've had good experience with both companies, so I'd highly recommend, if you're looking for lenses, to look at Sigma and Tamron. And also for like flashes and other accessories, consider third party. There's some that are good, there's some that are not so good, so I would definitely look online, read some reviews, ask around. But yeah, definitely third party. There's a lot of good third party makers of equipment that will give you a good product, and it might not be quite as expensive as the name brand product. Another piece of advice I have is to not skimp on your memory cards. So you can buy a really great camera, and if you buy a cheap memory card, you are going to regret it. I can't tell you how much I've lost from buying cheap memory cards. And you know where they ended up? In the garbage. And you know, the memory cards that I spent a lot of money on, I'm still using them years and years later. So your camera has a processor, and different memory cards are different speeds. So if you buy a cheap memory card, it's normally not going to be as fast as a more expensive one, and there's different classes and things. That's for a whole nother podcast, but you really want to make sure that you get a card for your camera that's going to take advantage of the processor speed and everything like that, because if you buy a cheap card that's slow, it's going to slow down your buffer on your camera, and your camera might take 11 frames per second, but if your buffer's full and it can only write to the card very slowly, it's gonna take forever for you to be able to take more pictures. So that's another rant of mine, and a little tidbit of advice for you. Let's talk about pre-owned equipment here for a second. If you're looking for higher end equipment, like if you're doing professional photography as like a full-time job, higher end equipment can be really expensive, and a lot of times pre-owned equipment is great, especially to get you started. And I will warn you that you want to get your pre-owned equipment from a trusted source. So a lot of great trusted sources would be local camera stores that have looked over the equipment and made sure everything's working. Personally, I don't get too hung up on like the shutter count. It's definitely good to, if you're able to know. I do know that Canon, a lot of times, they're, especially older equipment, it's sometimes hard to get that information off the camera. So don't be suspicious if you're looking at a Canon camera that is pre-owned and they don't have a shutter count for it. That's normally not a red flag or anything, but just make sure you're getting the equipment from somewhere reasonable. And if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. So make sure you're looking at it with a very critical eye. But certainly there's a lot of pre-owned equipment out there that people are wanting to sell just because they've upgraded or something. So be sure, if you're, especially looking for higher end equipment, to look at the pre-owned. Also, if you don't understand what you're buying, don't buy it. So if you're looking at a DSLR kit, that they're very common for, especially the entry level like DSLR or mirrorless cameras, to come in a kit with like 2 lenses and the body and sometimes a bag or a flash or something. Make sure you know what you're buying. If you are like, I'm getting all this crap with this kit that I'm buying, but I really don't need it, should I even buy it? So yeah, you really know what you're getting into. Step back, take some time to do some research. They're always running deals on cameras, so don't feel pressured to buy a camera just because you see a deal is running on it. companies are always running deals, so don't worry about that. If you don't understand what you're buying, it's silly to put your money towards it, because then later down the road you'll find, oh, I wish I would have put my money more towards this or that. So definitely know what you're getting into. If you don't understand the difference between a full frame camera and a crop sensor camera or a 4/3 camera, definitely take a step back and do some research on that. And all these things will be coming in future podcasts to sort of help educate you and give you some tips and tricks. But yeah, I just wanted to sort of get this first podcast to let you know, whatever equipment you have, that should be sufficient. I've seen great photos taken on very low megapixel cameras because it was the photographer that made the difference. They knew what they were doing. And I can't stress that enough. If you have a camera, just get out and use it. But if you're looking for new equipment, hopefully I gave you a little bit of insight and a couple tips and tricks for buying new equipment. But I think I've given enough bad advice for right now, so I'll see you later, Shutterbugs.